Hancioglu will be presenting today. Before I introduce them, a little bit about today's webinar. Mixplus is a new initiative of UNICEF's Mix or Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey Program, and is to support countries in conducting longitudinal household surveys using phones and collecting representative data and reporting on near real-time basis. It's built on 25 years of experience with Mix. Mixplus can be used for crisis monitoring, most recently during the COVID-19 pandemic, measuring program coverage, opinion polling, and generating data on indicators of child well-being. So a little bit about our presenters today. Tatjana is the Statistics and Monitoring Specialist in the Data Collection Unit at UNICEF. She is in charge of coordinating the Mixplus initiative. Tatjana joined UNICEF in 2013 and worked on coordination of and technical support to the design, implementation, and analysis of Mix in ECAR countries and DPR Korea. Prior to joining UNICEF, she worked for 6 years in the government sector on employment, monitoring and evaluation, and macroeconomic research and forecasting, and as a teaching assistant in statistics at the Faculty of Agriculture at the University of Belgrade. Attila probably needs no introduction, but let's do this. He's the chief of the data collection unit in the data and analytics section at UNICEF in headquarters. As the global coordinator since 2004 of the UNICEF supported Mix program, he has coordinated and provided technical support to the implementation of more than 200 Mix surveys around the world and facilitated more than 60 regional Mix workshops. His areas of expertise include survey methodology, assessment of data quality, data disaggregation, and analysis of child mortality. Before UNICEF, Attila was the head of the technical demography department at the, I'm going to say this wrong, I know, Attila, you can correct me, Institute of Population Studies in Ankara. Apologies for brutally saying that. But before we begin, some housekeeping points. We have scheduled about an hour and a half today, starting with the presentation, and then it's followed by the Q&A. As always, throughout the webinar, kindly remain muted and kindly write your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to group your questions and direct them to the presenters during the Q&A. Please note we'll move on to Tatjana and Attila. So I think Attila will be speaking first, so over to you, all yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Archana. I hope you can all see me and hear me well.
Yes.
Okay, I'll put on my the presentation, and please confirm that you can see the presentation on your screens.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So we'll be presenting this together with Tatjana and myself. This is about Mixplus as a longitudinal data collection tool. Tatjana and myself are just two of the members of the Mixplus group who are very intimately involved with this methodology. We also have Zula. In addition to Zula, we have Sinan, who is Zula is a data processing expert. Sinan works on sampling, and we also have Ivana, who works on data processing. But in addition to these staff members working on Mixplus, we have other colleagues as well who have been contributing big time to this methodology, to the development of this methodology, both at the regional level, at headquarters, and at country office level. So I will start the presentation, then I will give the floor to Tatjana, then I will take the floor back, etc. So we're going to do it back and forth between myself and Tatjana. The first parts we're going to spend a little bit more time because they are more about the methodology. Then towards the end, we will talk about some of the findings as well from the Mixplus surveys that we have been doing. And we'll finish off there with Q&A. So what is Mixplus? It's a new initiative for the Mix program. We support countries in implementing longitudinal representative household surveys where interviews are conducted over the phone. This is the basic description of Mixplus. This is done to collect data on the situation of children, families, and households on a frequent basis. at regular intervals, and we will talk about that in a little bit later during the presentation. And we aim near real-time reporting. So here's the template which Mixplus builds on. We have to have a household sample frame with phones. It can be any representative household frame. It can be a register, for instance, or it can be a completed household survey from before. Mix, of course, since we started this methodology, we are calling it Mixplus, but it doesn't need to be based on a mix. It can be based on a register, for instance, or any other representative household sample frame, which we will talk about later. Mongolia, in fact, one of the Mixplus surveys that we are doing now is based on a register, not a mix. So we start with a household sample frame, and from that sample frame, we select a representative subsample. From there on, more or less at the same time, we establish a call center, a data management system, which controls the call center. And the data management system is actually able to work on the basis of interviewers working from different locations. So a call center is not really a necessity. But in various surveys, Mixplus surveys that we have done, we have both been doing the interviews through a physical call center, as well as interviews working from separate locations. Then we start waves of direct calls to the households, to this representative subsample of households. With wave, we mean all of the households in the sample being called more or less at the same time, meaning during a month, for instance. That's called a wave of calls. And the interviewers enter the data. We do direct calls to the households. It is based on CATI, telephone interviews. The data is transferred thanks to this data management system to the cloud, and it is captured by the data management system. And then once the waves are completed, once the data is processed, we do the analysis and reporting. During the calls, we use CS Pro, as Tatjana will speak about later, I think. And then we export the data to SPSS. This more or less follows the mix template. We tabulate it there, and we present the results as either a statistical snapshot and or through a dashboard. Now that's the basic template. So any representative household frame, including a register or a completed household survey such as mix, can be used for this purpose. But all the households have to have at least one telephone number that we can call. We do regular calls to the same households. This can be monthly, bi-monthly. In the pilot that we did in Belize, for instance, at one point in time, the regularity was even more frequent. I remember when COVID came in that pilot survey, we decided not to wait for another month because we needed the information as quickly as possible. So after we finished a wave, we started the next wave in less than a month. So what we do is, because this has been a question that has been asked all the time, we select the sample households or mix, and we start waves of calls at regular intervals. The same households are called over time. So we don't change the household. The households that we select at the beginning, the representative subsample, those households receive the calls every month, bi-monthly, etc. What we can use this methodology for is quite exciting. First, we can obviously generate longitudinal data. We are aiming in both Mongolia and Georgia that we are conducting now a period of 1 year. So by generating longitudinal data over a year, then we can actually track changes during that period too. This methodology can be used to collect specific program indicators. We can use it for opinion polling. We can use it for crisis monitoring. Indeed, we did it in Belize, and we've been doing it in Mongolia and Georgia. We have a crisis on, as you know, called COVID-19. And we can even use it for question testing, because it's very inexpensive way of, it would be a very inexpensive way of testing the questionnaires or questions. But again, just to clarify, because this has been a frequent question that we have been receiving, Mixplus, maybe we are typecast as Mix. People assume that in Mixplus we also use the mixed questionnaires. We don't. Mixplus does not use mixed questionnaires, but it does benefit from the validated and tested modules of Mix as needed. So the way that we developed this was back in 2018, we had an expert consultation in New York. We brought together our UNICEF colleagues from the field offices, from regional offices, and a few country offices as well, and the headquarters team. And we brought together also other agencies who have been involved with this kind of work. Most importantly, the World Bank, who had been using this methodology in a slightly different way. There are some significant differences, but the overall template, what they were doing at the time was the same. So we brought together that expert consultation, and the next year, in 2019, we started to test this, pilot test this in Belize. We started, I think, towards mid-2019 or towards the end of 2019. In total, we finished that pilot test with 11 waves of calls. That was not a national survey, a national Mixplus. It was just covering the Toledo and Belize city south side. In Belize, we actually conducted the household survey, which formed the basis of Mixplus ourselves. So we didn't use an existing register, an existing household survey, etc. We actually piloted a household survey, a mix, in these two regions, two districts, and then we started the Mixplus on the basis of this household survey. We used a private vendor in that case. The data management system was completely different from what we're using now. There was a number of different applications in that pilot, including the fact that we were, of course, because this was a pilot test, we were experimental. And it was a great learning experience for us. For instance, we learned that if we were to target the same household member in every wave, it would increase attrition rates. We had a split sample in Belize. For some households, we were targeting, just like we are doing now in Mongolia and Georgia, any adult household member to talk to who would answer the phone. In the second part of the households, we were targeting specific individuals, mothers, for instance, in the households. But it became very obvious, which was also in the literature, that targeting the same person in every way would increase attrition rates. Usually people who are not conducting this, are not involved with this, might think sometimes that this is quite easy, but it is actually more time consuming than we thought at the beginning and much more sophisticated. And we will talk about some of the sophistications later. We tried to shorten some mixed modules and apply them in Mixplus, which succeeded. And we have been doing that in the national Georgia and Mongolia surveys as well. But the other lesson learned was that we need to start Mixplus as soon as possible, after the consent has been received from the households and the telephone numbers have been updated. That time between the acquisition of the phone numbers and consent and the start of Mixplus, if it is too long, then people will drop out. people would never enroll in Mixplus. And unfortunately, in Belize, because of bureaucratic reasons, that period was far too long, and therefore, going from the initial household survey to the Mixplus in Belize, we lost a large number of households. And while we were still continuing the Belize pilot, given that COVID had come in by then, and in fact, in Belize, when we were conducting the pilot, COVID started, COVID-19 came in, an emergency was declared in the country, and we very quickly started to collect information on COVID-19 in Belize, which was another piece of evidence for us that this could be a very flexible tool, and it would be used for crisis monitoring as well. And then while that was going on, we decided to start the Mongolia Mixplus, and then Georgia Mixplus followed. And this presentation will be mostly about Mongolia and Georgia. What you see on the screen is a basic description of the Georgia and Mongolia surveys. If you look at the sample frames, in Georgia, we are using as a sample frame the Mix 2018. In Mongolia, we are using the population and household register. Both of them have phone numbers. Phone coverage in both countries was 95%, very high. In both cases, we desired around 2,000 households, and we thought if we were to select close to 2,200 households, we would be able to achieve this number. In the case of Georgia, the stratification of the Mixplus sample is based on Mix 2018. This is sort of a limitation when it comes to using Mix or another household survey, because you are stuck with the stratification choices that have been used in the baseline. In the case of Mongolia, we have urban-rural in 4 regions, plus Ulaanbaatar as our stratification. For the estimation domains, again, national, urban, rural areas, but additionally in Mongolia, we're targeting regions. In Georgia, we have been randomly selecting 3 households from each of the clusters of the 2018 mix. In the case of Mongolia, we have much more flexibility because we are using the entire register of the country. And therefore, we have been doing systematic random selection in each stratum. Therefore, there's no clustering effect, and the sample households are widespread across the country. Whereas in the case of Georgia, we are confined to the clusters which have been used during the mix itself. We have completed 2 waves in Georgia and 4 waves in Mongolia. The 5th wave in Mongolia and the 3rd wave in Georgia are about to start. And so far, we have response rates of above 90% in Mongolia and 87% in Georgia, the 1st wave. Now, before all this happens, before all the waves start, the calls start, of course, in both cases, we have tested the sample frames. In both countries, we selected 200 households, and we started calling those households. In both cases, we were able to interview more than 60%. The reason why we went for the register in Mongolia, although we had a Mix 2018 in Mongolia, and we could have used as a starting point, we went for the register instead of the Mix because the register itself was updated in 2020 in February. So it was a more updated frame. Now, let me talk about coverage and non-response. This is a big issue in surveys which are conducted over the phone. This is not, by the way, a phone survey. It's still a household survey, which is conducted on the phone. There's some terminological issue there that I can respond to maybe during the Q&A if that is a question that comes. Now, in these kinds of surveys, there are several possible sources for non-coverage and non-response. One is the big question in our minds, of course, the households without phone numbers. There are still many countries where phone numbers do not exist in large proportions of households. What do you do in those cases? The literature is telling us that those cases in some countries, the households which do not have phone numbers, are usually very specific examples, very specific types of households. In fact, in a number of surveys that the World Bank did, they have been distributing phones, mobile phones, to these households that do not have mobile phones already. And in those cases, it has been found that the highest attrition during the survey has actually been with these types of households, because these are households that by choice in some countries do not want to have mobile phone numbers, or in some cases they're not within the coverage zones. But we also have cases like non-valid phone numbers that are available but never answer. There are phones which seem to be switched off all the time. And since we are doing a household survey still, and we are selecting households, people or households might be moving to other addresses. And of course, the typical, we have sometimes refusals. So what do we do in these cases to make sure that our coverage and response is as high as possible? Remember that in the case of mix, we are a little bit spoiled, because in the program countries that we work in, we usually come up with above 90 response rates. But in the world of phone surveys, those numbers do not really exist that much. Now, how do we address this? Post-data collection, for instance, to correct for non-response or to compensate for non-response. Post-data collection, there's the classical non-response adjustment. We use those households, and by using weights, in the same stratum, for instance, we try to compensate by increasing the weight of those responding households to account for those who have not responded. We assume that the characteristics of the non-responding households are the same as those who are responding. A second solution that is used sometimes is coming up with propensity score weighting. Again, involves some analytical processes to look at the characteristics of the sample and the responding crowd, the households, and then coming up with weights on some propensity score calculations. And then, of course, some simple substitution procedures. Sometimes you might find a survey program, not many anymore, but using things very ad hoc or simple substitutions, like using the very next case, let's use the neighbor, or cases that are drawn by hot-cold deck approaches, or very haphazard procedures. In our case, we have been using model-based substitution, and I will talk about it in the next slide. What is model-based substitution? In both cases, in both Georgia and Mongolia, we have been using this approach. We use basically Euclidean distance analysis. We're using a procedure which exists in SPSS. It exists in also the other statistical packages too. What we do is we try to select from those households which were not in the initial subsample, those households which are the closest on the basis of a number of indicators to the households that have not responded. So let's say there's 30% of the households which have not responded. So we go to the rest of the sample of the universe. It might be the register that we are talking about, or it might be the mix itself. And from the remaining households, we select those which are closest in terms of their characteristics to those who have not responded. So we are doing the replacing or substitution by selecting those households which are as identical or similar as possible that we have not been able to interview. In the case of Georgia, we used 20 indicators for this purpose. In the case of Mongolia, we were a little bit more confined. We were able to use 16 indicators. And in Georgia, we replaced 36% of the households. In Mongolia, we replaced 16% of the households. This methodology, as many of you know who have been involved with household surveys and with us, with the mixed program, will know that substitution is not something that we really sympathize with at all. We try to shy away from substitution. But in the case of mix, of course, our response rates are very high to begin with. We have over 90% response rates. So even if we do not do any substitution, the total numbers of observations we have are quite sufficient. And whichever method we would use, propensity scores or just classical weighting, manipulation of weights, we're not going to cause, most probably, because of the small numbers involved, a significant bias. But in the case of surveys on the phone, that bias might exist if we do not do something special about it. Therefore, we are using this approach. We have discussed this. We have been discussing this with the University of Michigan as well. In fact, during our discussions, we have been even saying that what we are doing can be labeled as substitution, but it can be equally labeled as imputation too, because we are bringing in another household to imputing that household values into the ones that we have not been able to interview. Now, I'm going to show this, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. Of course, unfortunately, this is animated, so even coming up with the whole thing is taking time. But just to say that in the first wave of both Mongolia and Georgia, and this shows Mongolia, by the way, there are several stages that we have used to do the validation, to do some validation and substitution. And substitution, by the way, before I forget it, is only done at the first wave of calls, before the first wave of calls. So we don't continue with substitution in the waves after wave one. But in the case of Mongolia, we were able to establish our sample because of the particularities, of course, in 4 stages. In the first stage, we selected the households. We reached some of them, didn't reach some others. Then we went back, used local governors, and those that we were not able to reach, we tried to get additional information from the field through the local authorities. We managed to get from some of them, for some of them, not from the others. So we tried everything possible, calling these households in our initial subsample and validating their information, updating their information. For those who remained, which was 346, we substituted them with another 346 households. And in those cases, we substituted them, though those substitutes, 344 of them, that you see in the middle of the screen here, we were able to identify. And then we reached some of them and interviewed some of them, but there are some that could not be substituted, or in the end, even from the substitutes themselves, were not interviewed or refused. And there were some those households that were substitutes, there were 156 of them that we were not able to reach. We again went back to the local authorities, tried to validate their information. For some of them, we were able to, for some of them, we were not able to, etc. So it was really complicated at the beginning to establish the sample by updating. It's a mixture of updating the information that we have on the households and their telephone numbers and doing the substitution. Okay, I think at this point, I hand over to Tatjana to talk about the indicators of sample implementation. And Tatjana, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Attila. So let's just, we tried to see how we are doing things on the, let's call it field. So how data collection is going. You can see on the screen 2 countries that we are implementing Mixplus currently, and you can see the data for data collection part of each wave in both countries. As you can see, the first one was quite long. One of the reasons is what Attila was talking about now. One of the reasons were actually these different phases of verification and substitution. So it took a little bit longer. Usually it takes 10 to 15 days when interviewers are calling the households. And you can also see here that Attila mentioned we plan to have 12 waves. And the initial plan was to have them each month, to have data collection in each month. But we are doing it, let's say, approximately every second month we have data collection. There is many reasons for that. We will go through some of them during this presentation, like how we are preparing questionnaires, what is going on with longitudinal data, and so on. So it will be quite clear. Can we go next, Attila, please? So let's look at the response rates. Response rates, we can say, are quite high, especially having in mind that we are calling respondents over the phone. In Mongolia, wave 1 was the highest rate, 97% after substitution, and then dropped to 92, and now it's very steady. In Georgia, we have the same response rates in both waves. Please take in mind that wave 4 and wave 4 in Mongolia and wave 2 in Georgia are finished, but data are still not published. So all data that we show here are preliminary data. When we look at the results codes, and there was already one question related to attrition, what is actually attrition rate? We can say very simple that this is the difference between response rate at the beginning at the end of the survey, which means first wave and the last wave, whatever that can be. So to be able to follow this and to react, we need to see what are our elements for non-response in each wave. In Mongolia, we have no answer or phone turned off, and additional respondent busy or not available to talk to us. This is in addition to refusal. For Georgia, do we have one? Can you go next? Yeah, for Georgia, we have again 2 waves. You see there are differences between one wave and next one. In one wave, we have no response after repeated call attempts. Next wave, respondent busy, don't want to talk with us. So we will follow this during each wave, and then to be able to take certain measures to keep our response rates high. As Attila mentioned, for now, we substituted only to have base sample in the first wave, and for now, we don't have plans to do it in next waves. For average number of calls, as expected, those are increasing during the waves. We have 2.8 in Mongolia for the total sample, and then in first wave, and then same for interviewed. And this, of course, from wave to wave will be different. Lower number of calls for interviewed, a bit higher on total level. Because of those people, we try to call more than one time, refusals, postponing, cannot be reached, and those kind of reasons. For Georgia, for now, we have data for one wave, and those are a little bit lower than in Mongolia. Okay, so for median duration of interviews, as you can see, the first wave in Mongolia was with lower median duration of interview in minutes, and then we increased. Why? Because, of course, one of the primary reasons is number of modules or questions in the questionnaire. The second reason, even sometimes if you have, like, we have one respondent, but we are asking question about children, for example. So respondent, if there is a child in a household, respondent will answer on questions for children. So this will also influence on duration of the interview. For families with children, households with children, the questionnaire will be shorter, and so on. So also this is really important because you see how the median duration of interviews increased in Mongolia and then dropped again in wave 4. It's dropped by purpose because we shortened the questionnaire. In wave 3, a lot of respondents complained about the length of the questionnaire, and they were really happy in wave 4. So this is something that we are getting from our team, which are collecting data. So, and they were even saying, oh, you know, I wanted to refuse you for next time, but then now it's short. If you will keep it short, it's fine. So this is obviously something that we really need to pay attention on, the length of the questionnaires when we have it. In Georgia, for wave 1, we have 11 minutes. Yeah, we will see there is one more thing, but Attila will mention this later, how we calculate this median duration of interviews. But yeah, let's not take time now. Attila will mention it. Let's talk a little bit about data collection and analysis system in Mixplus. So what we have 2 parts. One is central office, and the second part is interviewers system for data collection. It's important to say that central office is actually the whole project administration system. We are using it for project administration, for real-time data monitoring, what we are getting from the field, how interviewers are collecting data, and then we have real-time quality checks very, very frequently, every second day or every day, depending on the interviewers and data quality. Then we have interviewers system for data collection, which actually we are using for household assignment, remote voice calls, of course, capturing the data, and then sending data or synchronizing data to central office. This system is really flexible one. So for connection, we are using cloud. It can be CSWeb, FTP, IFSS, Dropbox, whatever the National Statistical Office prefers. So it's really flexible in many ways. The one thing is that for related to hardware or software that can be used. So this system can be used on Windows and Android platform. There is no difference. We are using CS Pro, as Attila mentioned, for central office and interviews application for development both of the system. We are using SPSS for data analysis, so we are exporting data to SPSS, and then countries are using Tableau for data presentation. The second thing that is really flexible is actually how we change application from wave to wave. It's very easy. So the only thing you need is good questionnaire, and the adjustments that needs to be done related to questionnaire are going really fast. Of course, it will depend on the size of the questionnaire, sample size, and those details. I will not go there now. Then we have what we can use to call our respondents. There are 2 options. One is call center, like we are using in Mongolia, is Cisco call center, and interviewers are using only tablets. So there is no separate mobile phones. Everything is done through the application. The second approach that it can be used, and we are using it in Georgia, is actually that interviewers have mobile phones. They are calling respondents, households, and then they are entering data directly to tablet. In this case, we don't have this type of, let's say, call center like we have in Mongolia, Cisco call center. Both ways are, there is no any influence or data quality or data collection. It's just, yeah, whatever country whatever country prefer, or in some countries there are some call centers, in others are not. Some have already tablets, some don't. So it's really flexible. We can use whatever we want. And sorry, Attila, just one more thing. So I need to say for a cloud, it's again, whatever country prefers. The only thing which is really important in the whole of this system is actually the internet connectivity. So we prefer, or ideal situation is to have constant, continued internet communication, but what is a minimum is actually 1 or 2 times per day, so interviewers can connect and synchronize data with central office, so the monitoring is possible and data quality check on regular basis. Okay, Attila, I think you
I'm taking
will
over.
take
Thank you
over
very
now.
much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatjana. I will talk about the questionnaires, but I'm very cognizant of the time. It's already 1:15, so we'll have to finish the whole thing in 15, 20 minutes. This is both for myself and Tatjana. Let's hope that we can go fast. But we're just showing the questionnaires that we have been using in Mongolia and Georgia. The modules, the topics are by wave, are on the screen. As you can see, there's a lot of flexibility. For instance, Child Money Program, which is here, has been used only once, but there are certain topics which have been there all the time, like distance learning, the first wave and the third wave in Mongolia, in Georgia, in both waves. So there's flexibility on what to include as we move further, because forward in the waves, it doesn't necessarily mean that we start with the same topic and we continue the same topic all the time. There's something beautiful about it, of course, because you come up with longitudinal data, but you don't need to include every topic in every wave. There's a lot of flexibility in this. Dissemination, as Tatjana also already mentioned, we use dashboards. In the case of Mongolia, we've been also the country itself has been releasing snapshots, statistical snapshots for the results of the waves as well. Now, there are advantages and limitations to this methodology. Longitudinal data is an advantage. We said is representative, great to be representative. High response rates. There's flexibility in topics. It's low cost, of course, compared to mix, and we can come up with results in real time when you can use it for many different purposes. But there are limitations, of course. In both cases, now we are calling the households, and whoever picks up the phone, as long as the person is a knowledgeable adult household member, we interview that person. So if we are asking questions about attitudes and behavior of the respondent on the phone, that person is not randomly selected. Therefore, there's a respondent bias there. Not the same person will be responding, and that person who responds will not be randomly selected. Therefore, that data about the respondent's own attitudes and behavior is not necessarily 100% representative. Obviously, with this method, we cannot do tests and observations that we are so much used to. We have limited time for interviews. Tatjana talked about the average durations of the interviews. The literature says don't go above about 15 minutes per interview, but even that has caused, apparently, in the case of Mongolia, some negative feedback from the respondents. So one has to be careful, but that means that not all questions can be asked. You cannot have a long questionnaires, and there's ethical issues. Not all questions can be asked on the phone. That you have this flexibility, or in an intimate rapport situation when you're doing a face-to-face survey, there's more flexibility to ask more sensitive questions. The low phone coverage in a country can be a problem, of course. And the coverage of the most vulnerable, if the most vulnerable are those who do not have phones, may be an issue in the Mixplus. Now, there are some devils in the details, of course, that we have been discovering as we move forward. For instance, telephone numbers, the quality of the information on phone numbers. Whenever we have been working with partners, we get the information, oh, there's really good phone numbers in the sample frame. It can be the mix itself. The phone number may have been collected, but we have been finding that that phone number, the quality of the phone number information might not be as good. We have been also finding out that there are frequent changes in phone numbers. People change phone numbers all the time, and that's creating a lot of complications. Households move; they don't stand in the same place. Of course, what happens to a moving household? Because it's a longitudinal survey. What happens to the sample weights? If a household has moved from the northern region to the southern region, for instance, what sample weights do we assign to them? Well, we found that as a solution to that, we had some methodological discussions. Of course, we are using the sample weights of the initial weights of the household, even if the household moves, because we are establishing a sample at the beginning. We're establishing that we are assigning sample weights, and we are not refreshing or updating the probabilities of the selection of these households. So they still would represent the same weights. We have been finding out that households, of course, as we knew, are dissolving or splitting. Who do we follow? If a household splits into two, who do we follow? And what does splitting mean exactly? It can take various forms. A household can be split in the middle into two. A household might be split into two, and some members of that household might be joining another household, which is not in the sample. So there are many combinations of possibilities in this. And that is something that we have been dealing with. Of course, these cases are not huge, and they are not, unless we do this for years and years in a country, then if we don't go beyond, let's put it that way, a year, then this is not going to be a huge source of bias. But for longitudinal surveys, which take many years, then this can be a real bias issue. That's a methodological discussion that we have been having recently. There's ethics involved with collecting or confirming phone numbers. Who do you ask the phone numbers? Can you ask the phone number of another household member to the person who is on the phone with you? How does this impact response rates? If we have only one phone number, can we collect more than phone number in a household during a mix, for instance? Measuring the duration of interview. What is actually the duration of an interview? Is it the beginning of the call? Is it the time difference between the beginning of the call and the end of the call? In which case, in the middle, there might have been some interruption. Do you take that into account? How does the data management system take that into account? Or are those a couple of minutes when between two questions or two modules, the interviewer and the respondent are conversing on something unrelated to the interview itself? Is that part of the duration of the call? So even the calculation of duration of interview, both conceptually and as well as from a calculation point of view, has been not all that simple. You need time to think. Data comes in all the time. The amount of data, and this is something that one of our colleagues from the World Bank had said at the time, that too much data is not really a good thing, because you need time to think and analyze and digest that data. And when data is coming in very fast, then that's a problem. Are we doing a longitudinal survey, or is this a series of cross-sectional rapid surveys? That's another issue that we have been grappling with. And of course, if we are keeping the same questions and the modules over time, it more approximates a longitudinal survey. But if we keep changing the modules and the questions, then it can look as if we are doing a series of cross-sectional rapid surveys. Now, how do results compare? We've been looking at how are we validating what we're doing? Well, we've been looking at age structures in both cases. For instance, they look very similar between the Mixplus and the mix prior to the Mixplus in both countries, as you can see on the screen. We've been looking at in Mongolia. We have done less in Georgia when it comes to this, but in Mongolia we've been looking at household and personal assets between mix and Mixplus. We found that we were finding higher percentages of assets in Mixplus. So we thought, are we actually having an upward bias compared to 2018 mix. But then we did another analysis. We took only those households from 2018 mix with mobile phones, and we started comparing them. We started finding out that most probably the increases that we see here are real increases over the two-year period. And at this point, Tatjana, over to you to talk about some findings on Mongolia. As we had agreed, we will go very fast on these findings.
Yeah, we just wanted to show you very fast, and all those data are available on Mix web page. So what we can compare over time. Please have in mind that it's really good before start using this data to go through the questionnaires and to see what is there, what we are asking and how. So here you have COVID-related results, avoiding public spaces. As you can see, even results stay the same at the wave 3 and 4 for percentage of respondents by whether they are able to avoid public spaces. The reasons for those who were not able a little bit changed. So we are trying to follow what is going on, and government is trying to use this data to, you know, to influence people over the media or to have some other measures that will help. Can we go to next, Attila, please? One other question was, okay, even if you go out, are you able to keep distance when you are in public spaces? As you can see, over the time, these percentages are getting lower, which is normal and expected. People are getting tired, people are getting vaccinated. But for example, in Mongolia, it's really important to look even what is going on when we disaggregate data. There are really big differences by regions. For example, you can see by regions in Ulaanbaatar, which is actually urban area, percentage was 81, but now it's 68 only. And this is also something that we can expect in big cities. So these kind of things we are trying to follow over time. Sometimes it's really difficult, but yeah, you need to pay attention how you are formulating your questions. We learned that on harder way, let's say. For example, this is one of really important results, COVID-19 worries. You would expect that these things, the percentage of respondents who are worried about that someone in their immediate family or household will get seriously sick and will get lower. But we can see in Mongolia, it's getting higher. So to be able to understand these results, we also need to see country context, what was going on. There was lockdown, number of cases, and those kind of things. So it's increasing, and also the number of percentage of respondents who are worried about household finance in next month also increased in those two periods. Can we go next, Attila? Okay, and distance learning. For those who are thinking about conducting survey Mixplus and following what is going on in learning these days, it's important to formulate questions so you can actually follow the changes. For example, in distance learning, in a first wave in Mongolia, we asked about school closure during the COVID. But then we realized when time was going, you know, everything was happening very fast. The schools were closed 1 week, and then next week they were opening and then closing again. So at the end, we came up with questions that are referring to previous week. And now we are trying to we are using the same questions we will use in next wave, so the data we can compare directly. So we ask about TV lessons and additional online lessons, and you can see results. And the next one, I think, yeah, we ask also about level of satisfaction with distance education, and in Mongolia, the level of satisfaction is decreasing over the time, and which is, I don't know if it's expected, but there are a lot of reasons that can influence this one. Next one. Okay, Attila, this is
Which
yours.
is why
Thank
I
you.
take over and talk a little bit about what's next for Mixplus, what's the way forward. And I'm feeling a little bit more comfortable now because we are still within the 1 hour, which is good. Well, first of all, there's new countries joining the program. The closest of which is actually Samoa. We've been having very good discussions with the Samoa Statistical Office, and that's about to start. But there are other countries who have raised an interest, very much so, actually, to join the Mixplus. In the meantime, for any mix survey, we are now including, as long as, of course, the Statistical Office wants to, including a module to obtain phone numbers and consent from the household, so that we have an opportunity to start Mixplus later. And that's something of an optional module that we have, which is soon going to be on the website as well. We want to create some core modules for longitudinal analysis. Look, one of the very surprising things have been, for me at least, has been to identify within our topics or domains of interest those core modules or topics for longitudinal analysis, and we seem to be doing quite a bit of discussion in the way of, so which topics do we include in this wave, and which one do we include in next wave? And we for some of the modules, as you saw on the questionnaires screen that I showed earlier, we've been changing modules as we go along, which is in a good way, because that means flexibility. But on the other hand, one of the powers of this methodology is to be able to come up with longitudinal data. And longitudinal data, by meaning that you would have the same topics and modules from one wave to another, means also less work. Because if you're changing the questionnaires all the time, even though these are shorter questionnaires, then you are coming up with new application, new quality assurance, quality tables, more new reporting templates, new statistical snapshots, new everything, new training, etc. So it takes much more time to prepare for the next wave if you change the modules. So we want to increase the number of these core modules that will stay more or less constant over all the waves, or at least systematically come in and go out every third wave, for instance, that we would be using. We think that we have sufficient experience now to come up with a library of modules that we can use in all the Mixplus surveys that will join the program. But also we have to improve the timeliness of what we do. We are sometimes taking a little bit longer than we expect to analyze and release the data. Of course, compared to what we have in Mix, this is way better. But I think the regularity between waves and being realistic about what can be done, what cannot be done, is really important, and we have to improve on the timeliness. We are aiming to come up with a major report in the case of Mongolia, and hopefully with Georgia as well, after 6 waves of calls that will, bring together all the information, all the data that we have collected, and synthesize them and come up with something which goes beyond a statistical snapshot. Hopefully that's going to happen very soon in the case of Mongolia. The big question, which everybody is grappling with, actually, is whether the data that we collect over the phone is good data, and then by good I am using as a benchmark household surveys, the face-to-face interviews, the data that we generate from there, or is this good enough data? So there's some methodological work out there. Depending on topic, I think there are some mixed messages that we get from the literature in terms of whether the data we get from phone interviews is equally good as those from the face-to-face interviews, or is it worse, or is it even better? So my my observation right now is that it depends on the topic, very much so. But I think ourselves, based on all this data that we have been collecting in different countries, we have to embark on some methodological work to look at that. We obviously need to do further research on the performance of substitution as well. This is a novel idea using Euclidean distance analysis for this purpose, and we have to generate more evidence as to whether it is working, how it is working, if there's any bias, then what direction is a bias going to, etc. So those are some methodological questions that we hope to answer in the coming months. And there we stop. We finish. I'm proud to say that we finished within an hour, so that's really good to leave time for Q&A. And I'm handing it over to Archana. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Attila and Tatjana, for an excellent overview of Mixplus and where we are with it and where we are heading. So I know there's been active conversations going on in the chat, and thank you, Tatjana, for answering some of the questions. But perhaps we could go to some of the earlier ones. But before we do that, Attila, I think it would be useful, you touched on this in your sort of opening slides about why would you consider this to be a household survey through phones as opposed to phone surveys? So perhaps you could talk a little bit about that, explaining the difference.
Sure. Well, there's a confusion in terminology there.
Right.
Because traditionally, what has been called phone surveys are those surveys which are based on phone lists, for instance, or RDDs, the random digit dialing type of surveys, data collection. In which case, the sample, the frame, is actually based on phones, right? And then the interviews are the data is collected over the phone as well. Typically, most people think of those as phone surveys. Whereas these types of surveys, the Mixplus, it could be, a longitudinal one, or it could be a one-off like Mix, for instance. If it is conducted on the phone, that doesn't necessarily make it, just like it is in the case of RDDs, a phone survey, because the frame that we're using is actually households. The only difference here is that we are doing the interviews on the phone. Now, does that qualify it to call this a phone survey? I just have a small worry that if we call this a phone survey, it might get mixed up or confused with other types of surveys which use as their sample frames phone lists, phone numbers, as well as the mode of collecting the information. That's just what I wanted to clarify. That's why I prefer to call this a household survey, which uses, phone interviews to collect the data.
Yeah.
So phones basically refer to one part of this, which is the implementation part, but not the sampling part. That's the distinction I wanted to make. That's why I mentioned it.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important distinction. So thank you for clarifying that. Perhaps we should just start from the beginning. I know Tatjana has already looked at some of this. Bo's question about attrition, which Tatjana has answered. It is sort of the diminishing of people responding throughout the waves for various reasons, as Tatjana had said in her chat. Going down further, there was a question about non-response rates and different from those who refuse to be interviewed. So if you interview 60% of the people who are interviewed, so what is the non-response rate? Is it 40% or those who cannot be reached? So I guess a little bit of clarification around this non-response issue. And you can look at the further issues that he had raised.
Okay, do you want me to come in? Or Tatjana,
yes, please.
would you like to come in? Of course, there's various reasons for not being able to successfully complete the interview of a household. And this might have to do with eligibility, or this might have to be being eligible but not responding also. There are specific ways that you calculate both completion rates, what we call completion rates, or response rates, which are slightly different in the case of household surveys, especially in the case of Mix, for instance. When it comes to Mixplus, I think what we are doing is mostly calculating response rates and completion rates the same way. so they are more or less equivalent in our case. We are equating them into one concept. But there could be certain certain result codes, let's say, which would rule out a household to be included in the calculations of a response rate. If the household that you have selected is actually not eligible at all, a phone number which doesn't exist actually, a household does not exist, that would rule out the inclusion of that household in the response rate calculations.
Okay, I think there's been a few questions more about also the substitution and how that works. So maybe they wanted a little bit more details on how, first of all, the original sample was chosen, and related to that, why not increase the original sample so you don't have to do as much substitutions later? But then how does that all relate then to the representativeness of that sample? So maybe you could tackle a couple of those types of issues. Over.
I'm trying to see if Sinan is actually on the call. He's our sampling expert who could respond, but I don't think he's on the call, right, Tatjana?
Yeah, I didn't see him.
Okay, this is a hardcore sampling question, of course. I would have preferred for Sinan to respond to it, but let me respond to it, of course. Look, as I said before, substitution, we don't like substitution as household survey establishment. We hate substitution. In fact, I vividly remember from many years ago, from the 80s, when I was still a young, aspiring academic, our sampling expert, when we were doing a survey, there was a heated discussion going on about substitution, whether to substitute or not to substitute. And he was saying at the time, look, we were doing a demographic survey, in which case the family planning method use was a really big one, a big objective of the survey. And there was the assumption that contraceptive use and employment were very strongly correlated, right? And if we were to substitute, if most of the cases that we are not able to interview women were actually contraceptive users who were employed, and therefore we were not finding them at home, and then we're deciding to substitute them with other women, that we would systematically increase our sample by substituting contraceptive users by non-contraceptive users who would be more easily found at home, who are not employed, right? So that's a good example. I think it is always stuck in my mind as a good example, or what the problems of substitution can be. On the other hand, there's the issue of those when you don't substitute, you have those households or women or individuals who have not responded at all. What about the characteristics of those? Now, in a typical household survey, you don't know those characteristics. You don't know that you have randomly selected a sample. A certain proportion of the sample has responded, and a certain proportion has not responded. But you do not have much information, typically in household surveys, about the specific characteristics of those who had not responded. Now, in the case of Mixplus, you have that information. You know the characteristics of those people who have not responded because they have gone through a mixed process before, or in the register, Mongolia, you know their characteristics on the basis of the 16 indicators or the 20 indicators that we have used for Euclidean analysis. So we can do a really good job, we thought, of selecting substitutes who would really be good and standing for those households who have not responded to us. So we would actually be minimizing the bias that we have in the whole thing by doing the substitution rather than not substituting at all and randomly selecting other households, or even worse, by applying some weights, manipulating the weights of those who have responded and expanding them as if those who have not responded have the same characteristics as the ones who have responded, which is not necessarily the case. So that's why we fell on doing substitution. And for the time being, the results that we are getting are really pointing out that with the choices that we have made in this are good. We are planning to write a methodological note, a paper on this too, together with the University of Michigan. Hopefully that will happen very soon. So we will be back more into the details of the substitution that we have been using with some more validation of the performance of this. So let's see what happens. But so far so good on substitution. And this is coming from someone who has big problems with substitution in household service.
Right. So what about the issue Mohammed is asking about, why not just increase the sample in the beginning when you're doing the first sampling frame, as opposed to doing this substitutions?
Absolutely. That's that. Actually, that was the first option. We were planning to select many more households than doing any kind of substitution at any point. That would be exactly what you do in a household survey, right?
Right.
But the question remains, those who have not responded, who are they?
Right.
One.
Right.
Secondly, you do less calls.
Yes.
Before you land on anything, in this case. And you're able to quickly, it doesn't come with any cost. You can easily substitution, no problem, and you can easily control and manage your sample size by doing this.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I think Tatjana answered the next question. Was the substitution only done on the non-response in the first wave? And the answer is yes. Is that correct, Tatjana?
Yeah. We only did it in the first wave, and as you could see on the presentation, the response rates are really high, and we are happy with that. So yeah, let's see we are following very closely what is going on with non-response, but for now we are not planning to do any substitution in further waves. Let's see.
Thank you. Adam is asking, is there a role of the local authority in terms of onboarding some of the respondents? And was that in any of your implementations?
Tatjana, would you like to tackle that question?
Yeah, of course. The country, NSO, and the government are really trying to get people on board with Mixplus. For example, in Mongolia, they had some media campaigns, knowing people in advance that survey is happening, trying to do, why is important that we are trying to improve lives of children and those kind of things. We were even thinking, the country is even thinking about introducing, in case if needed, about introducing some really, really small incentiveness for households, like phone credit, for example, in low amount. But for now, we are not doing anything on. So for now, we are going just with this, promoting the survey, and seems it's working. But over the time, of course, people will get tired. We are aware of that. So constantly, the country is really trying to find the ways how to make them work with us.
So you answered another question about the incentives, and are any incentives done? So in some cases, there might be looking at the error time.
The issue is that some countries in other surveys were doing it, and results are not very in favor of that. Seems there is no big big influence on people deciding to stay or to leave the survey. Right. So it's something that there are plus sides and minus. So we will need to see how things will develop.
Okay. The next question from Mohammed is about recording, and Tatjana, you answered that at the bottom, that yes, there is in Cisco, but only in terms of monitoring, not necessarily for anything beyond that, correct?
Of course. This is for data quality checks, and it can be done only if respondents parents are fine with that, if you get consent from them. Otherwise, ISCO is possible. Yes.
Okay. Tahir's asking about non-mixed topics. I know, Tatjana, you also provided the link to some of the Mixplus questionnaires, but I wonder if you wanted to say something about mixed topics versus non-mixed. I'm not sure, is there a distinction, or are we just talking? I wanted people to understand, do you consider these mixed topics, or what do you consider mixed topics? Over, just for a quick reaction.
Mixed topics are probably those which are typically found in mixed surveys, right? The standard questionnaires of mix, which are very much focused on children's well-being and women's well-being, etc. Of course, we have variability from one country to another because some countries add additional modules onto a mix. So it goes outside of the standard, but those are, they're not the majority. There's very few of them. So that's what we mean by mixed topics.
Right.
It's a bit of an our language kind of thing.
Yeah.
We sometimes mislead ourselves into thinking that everybody understands when we say mixed topics, what they are. Those are typically the ones which are found in the standard questionnaires. Now, again, that's why I emphasized at the beginning. This Mixplus does not follow the same template as Mix does, which is a standard questionnaire with certain topics in it. And Mixplus doesn't mean that we are using those questionnaires, those modules. We have a lot of flexibility. We are using we have used many topics in both Georgia and Mongolia, which have little to do, which have never been in mix before. And that's the beauty of this. There's a lot of flexibility. But again, we're UNICEF, we're working with governments, we're collecting data. It should be no surprise that the focus is on children, obviously. But there's still flexibility to ask questions or modules on issues which are outside the issue of children. However, even though these are short questionnaires, you have to have some internal consistency and a scenario to the questionnaires. It should follow a certain cognitive logic for the respondent. You cannot, a questionnaire, remember, is a tool for a conversation, for systematic collection of data. You cannot really, jump from one to the other without really preparing cognitively the respondent.
Right.
So the topics have to be somewhat related. They have to follow a certain logic, let's say.
Right.
But very open to non-mixed topics.
Yes, I just wanted to clarify that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Tatjana already answered. There was a question about sort of the duration of the interview and the standard. So it's about 15 minutes, which you had responded to earlier. And also there was a question about, the incentives, which we have already talked about as well. So we're moving down, and Rizwan is asking about, based on your experience, that was the duration one, sorry, let's keep going. Tatjana's response. Okay, Will asked, thanks Attila and Tatjana, in countries that have not conducted a full mix over 5 years or more, can Mixplus be introduced as an alternative to a full mix, but conducted in waves, focused on priority data gaps? Over to you.
Well, a good question, which I partially addressed at the very last slide, I think. Is this good data? And with good, I was using the benchmark of mix, a household survey, for instance, conducted face-to-face interviews. Or is this just good enough data? Is the data we are collecting through a Mixplus fit for reporting on SDG indicators, for instance? Methodological work needs to be done on that. And I was saying earlier that depends on the topic very much so. There are some sensitive, a little bit sensitive issues that you might not be able to get good data on from a phone survey. But also remember, we are confined with a very short amount of time for interviews. In a typical household survey questionnaire, you actually ask a lot of questions to come with one indicator. In the case of Mixplus, you don't have that kind of luxury. You're confined to a few indicators. So one of the things that we have not been able to do yet ourselves, and that's something that we need to do very quickly, hopefully for the upcoming new Mixplus surveys, is the following. Let me put it this way. In Belize, we had about 6 months between the baseline survey and the start of Mixplus. In the case of Mongolia, the sample frame is the register, which has limited information in terms of children's indicators. And we started Mixplus in Mongolia about 8 months, I think, if I'm not wrong, from the sample frame itself. In the case of Georgia, there's a difference of 2 years between the Mix 2018, which is the sample frame, and the start of Mixplus. So we are not able to say the following. For instance, if we were doing a mix survey, we're finishing a mix survey right now, we're in June, and we were able to start 2-3 months after we complete the mix with the Mixplus and ask the same questions in Mixplus, then we would be able to compare what we get in a Mixplus on the same indicator that we have in the mix. We haven't had the luxury yet, and we are hoping that one of the upcoming Mixplus surveys are going to give us that information. It will have to be on a topic by topic basis or an indicator by indicator basis. My understanding from the literature that for some topics, telephone interviews are going to give you good enough data or data which approximates the quality of the information that you get on a face-to-face interview, but for some other topics, not really. But we have to test these hypotheses on the basis of our own indicators to see whether child labor really works well on a phone, or maybe child discipline doesn't work on a phone. So we have some limited information on that, of course, limited comparisons that we have been able to do. But there's always this issue of the time difference between the baseline and the Mixplus data itself. So we cannot be conclusive at this point on this issue.
Thank you, Attila. I think this leads right into here's next question, which is, and you sort of answered it, why Mixplus when you have Mix already being rolled out in countries? So I think you touched on that as well, as why would you do this as well as a regular mix?
Well, it's real-time data. It's longitudinal data. It's cheap. You are collecting data in real time. You are collecting longitudinal data, which is different. Whatever the result of that methodological work that we need to do, whatever the result of that, this type of data collection will not replace Mix. Mix is different. A household survey is different. This is different. This is conducted on the phone. The mode with which you collect information makes a huge difference. We are talking about face-to-face interviews, which is the golden standard for this type of data collection. In this case, we're collecting information on the phone. This is different.
Right.
We don't probe, for instance, here. There's very little probing. There's a lot of probing in the face-to-face interviews that goes on. There's the actual rapport between the interviewer and the respondent, which is very important for the quality of the information. The physical presence of an interviewer in the household is very important. So that the fundamental differences between a typical face-to-face household survey and this one. And this one is not supposed to be replacing household surveys. As we can see, once the COVID is over, or COVID is coming to an end, or it's not as bad as last year in many countries. In some countries, of course, it is. But for those countries who have relaxed, who don't have the same challenges that they had last year, they're immediately trying to go back to the field and do household surveys face to face, because that's the golden standard.
Right. The next question is very interesting. I'm just going to tackle Bo's and Jay's together. One is more about what it's called. So Bo is asking, would it be more appropriate to call Mixplus a mixed method, considering the necessary prerequisite household sample? And Jay is asking why this methodology is named as Mixplus. This method of data collection can be implemented in countries with no standard mix. So maybe you can talk about both of those.
Let's settle on this. I think we have been thinking about this because what we're doing in Mongolia has nothing to do with mixed in a way, because the sample frame is a register.
True.
So right now, given that example and given the flexibility of using different sample frames, I think the reason that we're calling this Mixplus, let's settle on that, is because the mixed program is doing it.
Mhm.
Right? That's the distinction. Could we call this a mixed method? Yes, we can. We can in the contemporary sense, because in the old days, mixed method, the term mixed method used to apply to data collection practices which mixed quantitative and qualitative data collection. Nowadays, the term is used much more flexibly to refer to any data collection method or any data collection practice which envelopes different modes of data collection in it. It could be, phone data collection with face-to-face, face-to-face with web-based data collection. So yes, in a way, this is a mixed method.
Thank you, Attila. Diana, I think you've gone through this in your presentation, Attila, but she's asking, she probably missed it, but how do you obtain the phone contacts for the surveys?
Tatjana?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, it will depend what sampling frame will be used. If it's mixed, as Attila mentioned, all household surveys households from that survey needs to have at least one phone number. So it's already obtained when you are conducting mix. The interviewers will ask about permission to be called for Mixplus, and they will collect phone numbers. So this is if its sampling frame is household survey. But if it's register, like in Mongolia, we had more than one phone number almost for all households so this is also a register of the households, but with phone numbers. So it's not like random digital dialing or like you are picking numbers from some phone company. So, or it is from household surveys with actual consent to call them, or it is from population register, government population register, or household register.
Thank you, Tatjana. I think we just have, I know we're just running out of time. There's just a couple of questions from Ang. I don't know, Attila, if you could take these quickly. One is about the weighting. I don't know if you can see it in front of you. And a suggestion that the benefit, which is absolutely true, that they're suggesting is that you might know the treatment and effect of current and evolving interventions. And I think that's one of the pluses about Mixplus, that you can add questions, as you said before. Attila or Tatjana, do you want to take the question on the weighting, if you can see it in front of you?
I'm reading it, but I was distracted. The second point, the very last comment, of course, is very important. Yes, you can use it for that purpose. And we use it sort of in Belize, I think, as we were moving forward. There were certain interventions in place, and we actually asked questions about them. And to try to get in almost in real time what the effect was. So the other question is, if the household is missed for further waves, sampling weights is suggested as a possible method. I think the question is referring to using propensity weights, propensity score weighting, right? That's how I understand. Because in our case, what we're doing, let me explain what we do. The sample weights are calculated for each wave independently. Mm-hmm. We have sample weights which are established at the very first beginning from the probabilities of selection of the households. And after substitution, we establish those weights. And then based on the response rates for each of the weights, we recalculate those sample weights. So any household which may not be responding in the subsequent waves is going to be handled with the classical approach, which is that we calculate sample weights to stand for those non-responding households, basically. I hope this clarifies what we do at least.
Thank you so much, Attila and Tatjana. I know we're just a couple minutes over. I want to thank you both very much for an excellent presentation and a very good discussion in the chat, as well as in the Q&A. So I want to thank our participants as well. I want to remind you that we have 2 more webinars that are taking place before we take a break in July and August. Next week's webinar is on the 17th of June on qualitative data collection with Ben Hickler from Office of Research. And our last one will be on June 24th on ethics and remote survey data collection with Gabrielle Berman. So we hope you can join us for both of those. Again, thank you all very much. And thanks again to Attila and Tatjana for a great session. I hope everyone has a good rest of the morning, afternoon, and evening. Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.